Well, it's time to put my 1.5 master's degrees in English to good use. I'm going to find the definitive answer as to whether the children's cartoon character, Clifford the Big Red Dog, can technically be classified as a kaiju. Longtime viewers, or just anybody who's ever bothered to scroll down to the earliest videos on my channel, probably know that I'm a huge Game Grumps fan. I've been watching them for a while, and recently I've looked back at Aaron Hansen's opinions on what counts as a kaiju.
Grape ape, kaiju or no kaiju?
We have not had this discussion before.
Kaiju just means giant monster.
Oh.
Yeah.
Then perhaps grape ape is a kaiju.
Exactly, grape ape is a kaiju.
Hold on.
That clip was from 2016. Since then, Aaron has brought up this idea a few times in other videos and on Twitter. But it really picked up steam in late 2018 with this discussion on a Skyward Sword stream.
J Farmand 8 says, Aaron, if grape ape equals kaiju, then does that mean Clifford the big red dog equals kaiju?
Absolutely. Clifford the Big Red Dog is 100% a kaiju.
Wow.
It's not true.
It is true.
It's not.
It's 100% true.
Dude.
How is he not? Because he's just not.
Big animal.
Wait.
Yeah, that's a kaiju.
I'm no stranger to these kinds of debates. I did it with what counts as a Christmas movie, I did it with how to pronounce GIF/GIF, and I want to throw my hat into the ring for this one too. Let's break it down. What is the definition of a kaiju? And does Clifford the Big Red Dog fit into that definition? I'll also look into how various other large creatures fit in, but I'm mostly focusing on Clifford because 1, he's the one that the Game Grumps community debates about the most, and 2, that means I can have future editor me do stuff like this. Up front, I want to start by admitting that I had never seen a single Godzilla movie before starting this video, and my interaction with the word kaiju has been minimal. That might work to my benefit, since that means I can have a less biased perspective on the whole thing. But it could also mean that I missed a lot of key details. I tried my absolute hardest to do this justice, and I did a lot of research before I came to any conclusion. I'm happy to accept criticism and outside perspectives on this down in the comments, as long as you're nice about it. To start, for people who are totally in the dark, what is a kaiju? Generally speaking, kaiju are giant creatures that appear in Japanese movies. In other words, Godzilla and others like it. The word kaiju usually refers to either this genre of movie, or to monsters that appear in them. The word kaiju evokes images of giant creatures knocking down buildings and generally causing mayhem. The specifics of what a kaiju is are pretty slippery though. Lots of people have different ideas on what the term means. Let's take a closer look at Aaron's personal definition.
So here's my question to you, Aaron. Judging by the height of grape ape, do you think an elephant is a kaiju?
No, because that's its normal size.
Yeah, but like that's different.
That's not grape ape is a giant ape. Apes aren't that big.
Essentially, his definition for a kaiju is any creature that is supernaturally big. In other words, it's larger than a creature of that species could possibly get in real life. And that, by extension, would mean that all kaiju also have to be fictional. When I heard this definition, I was immediately skeptical. Those of you who watched my GIF video might remember that I believe in descriptivism, not prescriptivism, when it comes to the rules of language. Prescriptivism is the idea that words have fixed, concrete definitions, and you have to use them in a certain way, or else they are wrong. Descriptivism says that, basically, words mean whatever we say they mean. Definitions are born from the organic use of a word in context. And if enough people start using an old word in a new way, then that word's definition can change. It doesn't matter what the dictionary says, the most important factor in defining a word is how people actually use it in real life. There are a lot of silly internet and schoolyard debates about what certain words mean, but looking at them through a descriptivist lens shuts most of them down pretty quickly. For example, is a hot dog a sandwich? No. Sure, the written definition of a sandwich is filling between two pieces of bread, and technically a hot dog fulfills those requirements. But out in the real world, I have never in my life heard someone call a hot dog a sandwich in regular conversation. Aaron's definition of a kaiju as supernaturally big is way too broad to be useful, and it opens up the door to tons of characters that nobody in their right mind would ever call a kaiju outside of a silly internet debate like this. Characters like Grape Ape, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Foghorn Leghorn. If I was with a friend and I called Mickey Mouse a kaiju, they would look at me like I was crazy, and I have to stop and explain myself. Words exist for the purpose of communication, and if the way you use a word makes communication more difficult, it's not valid. So is that it? The answer is no? Video over? Oh no, I'm far from done. There's a lot of nuance around the use of the word kaiju in particular, more so than a word like sandwich. I still have a lot of other angles to look at this before I'm finished. Let's take a look back at the origins of the word. In Japanese, kaiju directly translates to strange beast, and while its current definition is more recent, the word is much older than that, used to describe all sorts of mythical and supernatural creatures. It was even used to describe dinosaurs at one point. It's tempting to say that kaiju is just the Japanese word for monster, but this is not the case. Japanese has several words for monster. The word kaiju is and always has been more specific than that. Looking at the types of creatures that the word has referred to in the past, we can find some common threads. First, the creatures are not especially human-like. They tend to be more animalistic. Beastly. And second, they were mysterious, unknowable. They were either mythical creatures that were not real, or in the case of dinosaurs, the scientific community knew so little about them at the time that they seemed impossible and fantastical. They're literally beasts that are strange. It's important to keep in mind, though, that this definition is derived from a tiny handful of appearances across centuries of Japanese literature. It's not the end-all be-all, only a starting point, because what I want to learn is the modern definition of kaiju. The word's popularity exploded with the release of the Toho Studios movie Godzilla, or Gojira in the original Japanese, in 1954. And you can see these same characteristics in Godzilla. Now, when most people think of Godzilla movies, they picture big, dumb, giant monster fights with lots of destruction and explosions. But if you haven't seen the original, or it's been a minute since you have, or you've only seen the heavily edited American version, you might be surprised to find that at least the beginning of the movie plays out like a slow burn horror film. Godzilla takes a good long while to show up on screen. The first few scenes show ships disappearing, fish dying, giant footprints, with the Japanese government scrambling to figure out what's causing all this. The superstitious locals referenced an ancient beast, which the characters dismiss until they eventually discover Godzilla later in the movie. Godzilla is an unfathomably ancient being that had lain dormant away from human eyes until it was awakened by nuclear testing. And is thought to be unkillable until scientists come up with an absurdly powerful fictional weapon called the Oxygen Destroyer to stop it. Godzilla is a beast that is thought to be mythical, that humans know very little concrete information about, and is terrifyingly powerful. That's the strangest part of the phrase strange beast. After this point, the word kaiju usually refers to the movies in the genre and the monsters that appear in them. You can get more specific and say things like Toho Kaiju to refer to monsters that appear in Toho Studios films like Godzilla, Mothra, and the rest. But generally, in modern day Japanese, a kaiju is a giant movie monster. That definition has eclipsed the obscure ancient use of kaiju to describe mythical creatures. And on that front, it's interesting to note that none of the most prominent Toho Kaiju are based off of traditional Japanese legends. They're all more original creations of the studio, maybe mixing and matching attributes of classic monsters, but they aren't directly inspired by any particular mythical beast, thus distancing the word kaiju from its initial usage even further. The original meaning of the word hasn't completely disappeared, though. A quick look at the Japanese Wikipedia entry for kaiju lists the Loch Ness Monster as a kaiju, and implies that kaiju can be used as a synonym for cryptid. But let me pivot this discussion a bit, because so far I've mostly been analyzing the way that Japanese speakers use the word kaiju. And that's not something I'm comfortable weighing in on any further, since I don't speak Japanese, and my ability to research Japanese sources is severely limited because of that. Any conclusion I would have come to would just be a stab in the dark. Best to leave that question to a native Japanese speaker. I want to turn my attention west and look at how English speakers use the word kaiju, because that is an entirely different conversation. When words make the jump from one language to another, as kaiju clearly has, their meanings tend to change. Time for a history lesson. In 1066, William of Normandy, a French ruler, conquered England. When he did, he brought over a bunch of French-speaking noblemen to govern with him. This caused a whole bunch of French words to mix in with English. In a particularly interesting example, the poor English-speaking farmers who raised livestock called their animals by their English names, pigs and cows. But the rich Frenchmen, whose only interaction with these animals was with the meat on their dinner tables, called them by the French words of pork and boeuf, which over hundreds of years became pork and beef. See what happened? In French, the word pork did and still does refer to a pig in all its forms. But when it was incorporated into English, pork changed to refer to only the meat of a pig. So even though kaiju is originally a Japanese word, it's been kicking around in the American lexicon for a bit, and I can't use only the Japanese usage to determine its English meaning. So let's tackle that question. What does the word kaiju mean in English? For that, the first question I need to answer is when English speakers adopted the word. The Google Books Ngram Viewer shows the frequency of words across published English media over the years. You can see that kaiju sees almost no use until the 1990s, and then shoots up pretty quickly around the 2010s. But I want to get more specific, because there's no way to tell from this whether any untranslated Japanese works skew the graph. So I pulled up the English scripts of prominent Japanese kaiju movies from around that time period. Now again, I hadn't seen any of these movies. My thinking in doing this was that somewhere, I would find a point where the English translator stopped translating kaiju as monster and opted to leave it in untranslated instead. This would tell me roughly the year when kaiju became a commonly understood word within the English audience for these movies. The results I got were not expected. I combed through recent kaiju movies, looking for any of them that use kaiju in the English script. Granted, I didn't check every movie, but in the end, I didn't find any Japanese-made media that used the word kaiju in its English-translated script. Not even the brand new ones. In fact, in my search, I only found 2 movies to feature the word kaiju, and they were both American-made. Pacific Rim and its sequel, Pacific Rim Uprising. If you're not familiar, Pacific Rim is an American movie that riffs off Godzilla and other Toho kaiju movies, released in 2013. Its script consistently calls the antagonistic monsters kaiju throughout its runtime. Already, 2013 is way later than I was expecting to see the first real appearance of kaiju in English, but there's more to it. In the very beginning of Pacific Rim, there's a bit of text that defines kaiju for the audience. That's already huge because the fact that the movie has to give the audience a definition confirms that this was not a widely known term before this point. But even more surprising, it states that kaiju translates from Japanese to giant beast. Not strange beast, giant beast. First off, that's just not an accurate translation. In no way do these kanji say giant or refer to size in any way. But more importantly, this tells me that Pacific Rim almost single-handedly introduced the word kaiju to the American public. And they did it with a definition that deviates pretty significantly from the original Japanese. I'm sure that big fans of these movies already knew all this, but to me it was a massive revelation. The term surges in popularity a bit after 2014 and the release of the American Godzilla reboot. This movie and its sequels, collectively referred to as the Monsterverse, are pretty popular and are definitely partly responsible for the term's spread. But the movies themselves don't actually use the word kaiju in their scripts. They call Godzilla and Co. first by the name Muto, or Massive Unidentified Terrestrial Organism, and then later they use the term Titans. Another huge key piece of this puzzle comes with a series of tweets by Michael Dougherty, the director of Godzilla King of the Monsters, where he said that the Monsterverse opted to create their own terms because Pacific Rim had, quote, already taken the word kaiju. That's a big deal for this discussion because it implies that Pacific Rim has near complete control over the use of the word, or at least it did at one point. In the totality of American film, kaiju is basically a made-up fantasy term that only applies to the Pacific Rim franchise.
I was 15 when the first kaiju made land in San Francisco.
50 years ago, an alien force known as the Formics attacked Earth. Tens of millions died.
Does that mean that, to English speakers, the only kaiju are the Pacific Rim monsters? Well, no. A quick look through Google shows that clearly English speakers recognize Godzilla as a kaiju. The Monsterverse movies might not use the word themselves, but fan discussion surrounding them definitely does. The fact that Michael Dougherty felt the need to make a statement on this is proof enough. Okay, sure. So the Pacific Rim monsters are kaiju, and Godzilla is a kaiju. Those are not up for debate any longer. Given that, can you reverse engineer a definition of kaiju by tracing their common traits? Well, I tried and I ran into problems immediately. It's just too small of a sample size. There's so much overlap between these creatures that it's impossible to determine what characteristics are essential to the kaiju. Is it their height? The property damage they cause? Their near invulnerability? Their reptilian design? All of the above? None of the above? At this point, I'm reminded of something that Dan said in that initial 2016 Game Grumps clip.
He's a monkey.
Is King Kong a kaiju?
No.
Yes, he is!
Is he really?
King Kong is absolutely a kaiju!
I thought all kaijus were like kind of lizardy in their nature.
No!
Unlike Aaron, Dan wasn't super familiar with the Toho Kaiju franchise at this point in time. His only experiences with the word before this were probably Pacific Rim and Godzilla 2014. As far as he could tell, it's scales that make a kaiju. We have to dig deeper. Find some more ways to include or exclude different creatures into the definition of kaiju. So like any good responsible researcher, I went to Wikipedia. And by that, I mean I went to the Wikipedia page for kaiju and looked through the history of edits made over the years. This can tell us a little bit more about how the term evolved over time. The page for kaiju was created as early as 2002. I skimmed through the years watching it grow and become more detailed. The first thing of note that I discovered was in 2008. That year has a much higher than average number of revisions. There was a tug of war between groups of editors that kept arguing over whether kaiju have to be Japanese. We've got ourselves another anime situation. To touch on a completely different debate for a second, the word anime is another Japanese word that recently transitioned into English. English speakers generally use it to refer to Japanese animation. Whether anime can only be used to describe Japanese content, or if it can also include animation in a Japanese style, is an extremely contentious question. But in Japanese, anime literally just means animation. So ironically, while Americans are at each other's throats over what counts as anime, the Japanese are over there calling all cartoons anime. Anyway, the debate around anime is complicated, and I'm not going to weigh in on it any further. But as for kaiju, the question is a lot simpler. No, kaiju don't have to be Japanese in origin. For proof, look no further than King Kong. He's American, and even though he was introduced in the 1930s and predates the modern usage of kaiju, ever since his inclusion in the 1963 film King Kong vs. Godzilla, he's been happily adopted into the Toho monster universe, with both English and Japanese speakers calling him a kaiju. Plus, in a shocking twist, it was an American film that began the kaiju genre. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is a 1953 American movie about a giant dinosaur. It was released in Japan just a few weeks after Godzilla, with the translated title of Genshi Kaiju ga Aroerero. There was a reason why this Wikipedia debate happened in 2008. That was the year Cloverfield came out, an American movie about a giant monster. A lot of the edits made center on whether Cloverfield counts as a kaiju movie, but the Japanese purists eventually lost out, with any edits that specify against American movies disappearing by 2010. And by 2013, King Kong and Cloverfield appear on the list of major kaiju films. Next, I want to revisit the question of whether kaiju can be humanoid. So far I had assumed no, but one movie gave me pause. Frankenstein vs. Baragon. This movie consistently shows up on lists of kaiju movies. And around 2013, the Wikipedia page for kaiju uses this as evidence to assert that Frankenstein and other universal monsters like Dracula and Wolfman are also kaiju. But I'm sticking to my guns on this one. Kaiju cannot be humanoid. First, the word for humanoid monsters is kaijin, a word that consistently appears alongside kaiju to distinguish the two across all sources I've found. Second, just because Frankenstein vs. Baragon is a kaiju movie doesn't mean that Frankenstein is a kaiju. It's a kaiju movie because of Baragon, not Frankenstein. Frankenstein isn't a kaiju any more than the Jaeger mech suits from Pacific Rim are. And third, a single movie, especially one so old and obscure, isn't enough to change the entire definition of a word. Anyway, by 2018 this passage has been removed, so it's a moot point. I also want to bring up the term Daikaiju that appears in more recent versions of the page. Daikaiju means giant kaiju, and would seem to imply that the average kaiju doesn't need to be large. But Dai is an honorific, and it could just as easily refer to the general power and greatness of a kaiju. Besides, Daikaiju isn't a widely known term. Even people who are familiar with kaiju might not know it. Alright, we're finally getting somewhere. Maybe Pacific Rim was the first time most Americans saw the word kaiju, but it's exceedingly clear that English speakers recognize the Toho Kaiju franchise as well as a host of other giant fictional monsters from disparate studios as kaiju. Using the Wikipedia list of kaiju movies, and cross-referencing it with a few other online lists of kaiju films, I gained a better understanding of what kinds of creatures fall under this category. I think I'm ready. Now, we have a large enough sample size to compare for common traits. After combing through as many of them as I could, here are what I found to be the most essential common threads. First, like I've been saying, kaiju have to be beasts, creatures that bear little to no resemblance to humans. A giant gorilla is about as close to a person as a kaiju gets. Second, kaiju have to be big. How big? Well, it's not like there's a hard cutoff. But I looked hard and I was unable to find a kaiju that was under several stories tall. Kaiju might translate to strange beast, but it's clear that the Pacific Rim definition of giant beast is more reflective of the way English speakers use it. I'm going to formally disagree with Aaron's assertion that a kaiju is just bigger than the real-life animal it's based on. Plenty of kaiju aren't based on any particular animal, and something like, say, a 3-foot rat is pretty far removed from the giant monsters I've been seeing in these movies.
Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist.
At bare minimum, a kaiju has to be taller than a human. A huge part of their appeal is the way they tower over people. Third, kaiju have to be, I want to say fictional, but that's not the right word. More like, they can't or don't exist in the real world. Here's what I mean. Obviously, Godzilla and King Kong are made up, with no direct real-world equivalents. But there are tons of kaiju that are just straight-up dinosaurs. Even though dinosaurs did exist once, they don't anymore. There's no way that a dinosaur can show up on my doorstep tomorrow. The fun of kaiju movies is to imagine an impossible, terrifying monster, to explore a scenario that could never happen in real life. I want to linger on that a bit. The requirement that kaiju have to be fictional opens up another angle to this definition. If kaiju only exist inside fictional stories, then part of what defines a kaiju is tied up in how the stories treat them. So hypothetically, you could have two very similar giant creatures in two different stories, but one of them could be a kaiju and not the other, depending on the presentation. For example, fourth, kaiju can't be a common occurrence in the story that they're in. Plenty of stories have giant monsters, but if the people in that story's universe are used to giant monsters running around and don't think it's a big deal, it's not a kaiju. When a kaiju appears, it shakes the foundation of reality itself. Fifth, and this is one you might not expect, kaiju can't talk. Sure, they can be capable of rudimentary communication, like how King Kong uses ape sign language in the most recent movies, and on very rare occasions, a kaiju might speak a word or two. But a key part of any kaiju movie is how humans can't directly communicate with it. They're not human, they're a force of nature, and humans can't reason with it. Sixth, kaiju are organic beings. Mecha kaiju are their own thing. And seventh, kaiju are beings with a lot of physical strength. Sure, there are some kaiju with psychic abilities, but kaiju are known for using brute force to smash up everything around them, rather than stealthily and deliberately taking out their targets. Combined with their massive size, it's their physical power that makes them so intimidating. Basically, you wouldn't want to get near one for fear of being squished to death.
Well, he's pretty big.
So is that the definition of a kaiju? Am I saying that to decide whether a certain monster counts, you should pull up this list and see if it checks all these boxes? No. See, I'm not done yet. Remember, I'm a descriptivist, not a prescriptivist. I already said I don't believe in such rigid dictionary definitions. But there's something bigger than these criteria. A common theme that ties all these traits together. A perfect, descriptive, and qualitative explanation of what makes a kaiju a kaiju. It's the way they strike fear and awe into human beings. That's what it's always been about, going all the way back to the original Godzilla. Remember, Godzilla is an allegory for the atomic bomb. It came out as a direct response to the unimaginable destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese people were reeling from what happened to them at the end of World War II, and they used movies to cope with it, resonating with a giant monster that also imparted a sense of otherworldly terror. Kaiju are not human. They are nowhere near human. They are so far above us in both size and destructive power, and we have no way of communicating with them. Kaiju are forces of nature whose mere presence reminds us of how small and helpless we really are. If I were to boil it down even further, if a monster causes a person to make this face every time they see it, then it's a kaiju. And yeah, that does mean that the Jurassic Park dinosaurs are kaiju, even if those movies aren't typically listed as kaiju movies. Okay, we have our definition for what makes a kaiju. With that in mind, here are a bunch of creatures that qualify. Any dinosaur that is transplanted to the modern day. Certain non-humanoid monsters from Greek mythology, like the Hydra, Cerberus, Charybdis, and Scylla. The Loch Ness Monster is a kaiju, but most other cryptids like Bigfoot or the Jersey Devil are either too humanoid or too small to qualify. The Mind Flayer from Stranger Things Season 2 is a kaiju. The Demogorgon from Season 1, though, is not quite big enough. Insectosaurus from Monsters vs. Aliens is definitely a kaiju. Anybody remember that movie? A dragon could hypothetically be a kaiju, but only in specific scenarios. For example, Toothless and most of the other dragons from How to Train Your Dragon are not kaiju, but the giant mother dragon at the end of the movie is. The Imprisoned from Skyward Sword is totally a kaiju. Nice, bringing it full circle.
Oh, look at his little feet!
Look at my doofy Muppet feet!
I love him! He's so good.
Alright, we have our definition of a kaiju. It's time to look at the other half of the question that's in the title of this video. Clifford the Big Red Dog. Okay, so declaring Clifford a kaiju is going to be an uphill battle. If you ask a random person off the street whether this is a kaiju, assuming they don't watch Game Grumps, they probably say, "What? Of course not, are you crazy?" And when working through a descriptivist point of view, that counts for a lot. But let's figure out why someone would feel this way about Clifford. What about him makes people less likely to classify him as a kaiju? If we skim through the basic criteria I laid out a moment ago, we find that Clifford more or less fulfills all of them. He is an unnaturally large dog in a world where that is not the norm. The one that might give us pause is the one about not talking, but I think we can work around this one. There have been several different iterations of Clifford over the years, and he does talk in most of them. But remember, the key detail is about talking to humans. He talks to other dogs, and his speech is translated into English for the audience's benefit. But his owner Emily Elizabeth and the other humans in the stories can't understand him. Clifford checks all the boxes. Like I said earlier though, fitting into a point-by-point definition is less important than how people feel about him. Does Clifford inspire awe? Does he make the humans around him feel cosmically insignificant? Does he make people do the Dr. Grant face? He doesn't really. Looking back at that rule about kaiju not being a normal occurrence, Clifford is the only giant red dog in this universe, sure, but the humans in any Clifford Booker cartoon are able to roll with the idea of a giant dog pretty easily. Clifford has become a normal part of life here. Unlike Godzilla, who still inspires terror and awe no matter how many times he shows up across a series of movies. You can't get accustomed to a kaiju. But I'm not just going to say no and leave it at that. It's not that simple. I reconsidered my position a bit when I saw the trailer for the 2021 live-action Clifford movie. Because this is not a cartoon, the people in the movie have much more realistic and true-to-life reactions to Clifford. In this trailer alone, we have several human characters make shocked, awestruck faces when they first meet him. In this movie, Clifford is closer to being a kaiju than he's ever been. Still though, I'm not willing to go all the way and say that 2021 Clifford is a kaiju either. Because we see later in that same trailer that after a human character gets over their initial reaction and spends a little bit of time with him, they come to realize that Clifford isn't so scary. Again, a kaiju isn't something you can get used to. It comes down to framing. A creature can check all the boxes, but the story needs to treat it like something existentially massive.
You're a
giant beast.
right. Just not a
Kaiju.
Yeah? What's the difference?
presentation!
What that means is that Clifford could become a kaiju in the right story. One where none of the human characters are ever completely calm around him, and who are reminded of their insignificance every time they look at him. And I'd see that movie. The ball's in your court, Paramount. There's one more thing I want to discuss before this video ends. Because remember back in the beginning of this video when I said, and if enough people start using an old word in a new way, then that word's definition can change. Well,
Grape, ape, kaiju. Oh my god, it came right up.
Yeah, because he's a f***ing kaiju.
Wait,
And probably because I already had this discussion with Ross.
God damn it, it's Aaron Hansen on Twitter.
kaiju is still a pretty new term. Remember, it's only been formally introduced to the English-speaking masses for 8 years. And even now, it's not the most well-known term out there. Aaron Hansen is a moderately famous internet personality. He might have enough sway over enough people to actually change the definition of kaiju. It could happen. It's already started to some degree. Several other internet outlets have picked up on this debate, and Clifford pops up in conversations regarding kaiju more and more often. All it takes is for enough Game Grumps fans to start using kaiju according to Aaron's definition, and eventually we could reach a tipping point where that becomes the more accepted definition. So in conclusion, no, Clifford is not quite a kaiju, but he could be.